The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Our first bonus show story today, my girlfriend actually mentioned to me yesterday. She said, hey, did you hear that they might have found the bones of Amelia Earhart? And when she said it to me, I said, I thought that we already went through this before, like that there had already been a time when it was believed that the bones of Amelia Earhart had been found, but then it was determined that they weren't. And that's not untrue. And the news story is that these are not bones that have recently been found, but back in 1940, there were bones found on a remote island in the South Pacific. And then it was believed or determined to have been the bones of a man. And now scientists have again suggested that they actually might have been Amelia Earhart's bones all along. Now, for people who maybe are from other countries where you don't know about Amelia Earhart, even though I think that there's some kind of sort of world knowledge about her. Or listen, many people might not know about Amelia Earhart. She was sort of the first, at least notable female pilot.
She was the first woman to fly across the Atlantic.
That's exactly right, by herself. And she ultimately, presumably, crashed her plane and died, even though there are all sorts of theories that she actually survived and was living somewhere and there's some kind of assumed identity, although I don't know why you would do that. There was no indication that she was looking to abscond in any way. I don't know.
Well, if these bones were hers, I think it's reasonable to suggest that she could have been a castaway on the island for some time.
Sure.
Until she starved to death, I guess.
Yeah, and the assumption would be that she was able to sort of, in a crash landing, get herself to the island, or that she was caught somehow.
Crash near the island, maybe?
Is it possible that the bones just, that the bones just washed ashore or something like that?
That too, yeah.
In any case, these bones were found when a working party was brought to the island for what was called the Phoenix Island Settlement Scheme, and they found a skull. And they started investigating and doing a search of the area. They found additional bones. They found a shoe that did appear to be a woman's shoe, but big picture, the idea was these are the remains of a man. But now, once again, there is the idea that these might be Amelia Earhart's bones. But will we ever really know? I mean, it just seems that with each passing year, it's less likely that we'll really know for sure.
I think because the technology is advancing, we could know. Because back in the day, they didn't have DNA testing. They didn't have things like 23andMe and Ancestry.com that we have now, so we can determine whether or not these bones belong to a male or a female.
Right, but that wouldn't tell us whether it's Amelia Earhart, and we would, of course, have no DNA. Unless I'm wrong, I don't think, like, you need to compare a DNA sample to something else, and I don't know that we have sort of like a base DNA sample for Amelia Earhart.
Maybe we can't determine it 100%, but if we get the proportions right, I think we can come to a 99% certainty. Yeah, and I think that's good enough for me.
Maybe, I mean, listen, 99 would be pretty good. I just don't know how we could even get to that level of certainty, because I thought, and again, I'm not a DNA expert, even though, yes, I was judged to have the highest percentage of Jewish DNA that our analyst who evaluated our DNA profile said. That doesn't make me an expert in DNA. And I just don't, my thought was we need a reference sample to compare. And that beyond just knowing if it was a woman and maybe sort of like her general ethnic background, I don't know how much closer we could get to saying it's Amelia Earhart.
And because Amelia Earhart's been dead for so long, it would be really hard to get that sample. I know her descendants have been working for a long time on trying to verify that these bones are hers or find her somewhere else in the middle of the Atlantic.
Do you care that much about the Amelia Earhart story? Like, I find it interesting, but I know that there's people who still are fascinated with it. And I think she just crashed her plane and died, and that's sort of it. And you know, the oceans are really big.
It's just folklore, I guess. I mean, she's a very notable person, being the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. So in telling her story, I think it's nice to know how it ended and have some certainty there.
Some kind of closure or something like that. Do you know what the, like, obviously these bones were found in an island in the South Pacific. She successfully flew over the Atlantic Ocean. Was she doing some other, was she trying to set some new record when she, like, over the Pacific Ocean? I don't know what exactly she was doing.
I don't know if it was a record. Maybe she was just doing it for fun. I don't know.
A pleasure flight. She was pleasure flying or something,
By the way, I mean, Earhart, that's a great last name for a pilot.
I know, yeah. What, it's sort of like, well, anyway, I can't think of one now, but there's a lot of those, of those examples. Okay, Donald Trump is going to be meeting with both CEOs from the video game industry as well as critics of the video game industry, like this guy Brent Bozell, who I find to be a total bozo, excuse the pun, who for decades has been saying that video games cause real-world violence, and that the liberalization of decency rules on television are just an absolute disaster and decaying the fabric of morality and all this other stuff. It could actually get interestingly ugly at this meeting. I think Trump is basically clueless on this issue.
Yeah.
And if you sit Trump down with someone who can make a good case for why violence in media makes people afraid but not violent, which is one academic theory that's out there, I think Trump would come away convinced of that. If you sit Trump down with somebody like Brent Bozell, almost said Brent Bozo, with Brent Bozell, he will come away believing that violence in video games is sort of a scourge of humanity, and that it's the cause of all violence, and that getting rid of violent video games would eliminate all school shootings. I just think Trump is totally clueless on it. So what I'm hoping for is that it just gets really ugly between these other people at the meeting.
Yeah, and I don't think Trump knows anything about video games. His hands are too small to handle the controller.
Absolutely.
So that would be an issue too.
Yeah, he reportedly can only play
ping pong?
Well, ping pong, but that's not a video game. But you know, the Wii type ones where you just like have this, you're basically like clutching a controller with your entire hand, and it doesn't require sort of like fine motor precision.
That's interesting. Yeah.
I'm kidding, by the way.
It's disappointing too that they seem so willing to put restrictions on the First Amendment.
Yeah.
And yet any possible restriction on the Second Amendment, we just can't have that.
No doubt about it.
But if you talk about people who are adults and should have the ability, I guess, to purchase violent video games, because it's not like they're making a direct threat against anyone
let me make a counterpoint to you.
Yeah.
Let me play devil's advocate. There is a view of the First Amendment, if you believe that sort of like there is total restriction on speech on one end of the spectrum and you're a free speech absolutist on the other end of the spectrum. A very common view is that you are close to a free speech absolutist, but you stop slightly short on an incitement to violence. That an incitement to violence, like for example, as the example I've given, if you're on a plane and you go, that guy's a terrorist, he's about to try to sabotage the plane, and that incites people to attack that guy, that would not be legal protected speech. If you buy into the notion that the video games cause real world violence, you're sort of saying they are an incitement to violence in the same way that yelling, get the terrorist on a plane would be. And thus you could argue, this is not me arguing it, this is the argument that some would make, you could argue that you would be legally allowed to curtail the availability of those games.
Yeah, I see a difference there, which is in one instance, you're talking about inciting violence against one specific person.
Sure.
Whereas in another, it's a generality. It's like me saying, oh, I'd like to hurt someone versus I'd like to hurt you. One there could be interpreted as a crime, and one is not, at least in our current understanding of the law.
That is a defense. It is a defense, but certainly there, it sort of relates to this. Remember stochastic terrorism, the idea that like when Glenn Beck had his TV program and he was ranting and ranting and ranting about the Tides Foundation.
Yeah.
Statistically, he wasn't inciting anybody individual to go and attack the Tides Foundation, but eventually a guy was arrested on his way to attack the Tides Foundation who listened to Glenn Beck. Legally, you're right that Glenn Beck wouldn't really be liable for that, the same way that Alex Jones wouldn't if he says...
Bill O'Reilly.
Or Bill O'Reilly or whoever talking about Comet Ping Pong or whatever conspiracy theory. But we're starting now to get into a gray area in terms of what constitutes an incitement to violence. In any case, I think that video games are protected speech. I think that it's perfectly responsible to say that here's an age limit suggestion for a particular video game, but I do think that video games are a form of speech that should not be regulated in that way.
I've noticed that your definition of a free speech absolutist is different from, say, Kyle Kalinski's or Dave Rubin's, because they self-identify as free speech absolutists, and yet they are in favor of those specific restrictions on the First Amendment, like you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, you can't make threats against someone, that kind of stuff.
Well, if that's a free speech absolutist, then what would you call someone who doesn't even believe in that?
It's a bad term.
Yeah, I don't think it's a good term to reflect that.
I think they say that so they can come out against like social justice warrior types. Who want to place restrictions on campus speech and have safe spaces and that sort of thing. Yeah, well, it's certainly been profitable for many of them to use that term very, very much to their advantage. Hey, here's something really weird. There's this sort of, I don't know if it's a stereotype, but there's an understanding that at the NFL Combine, which is sort of this pre-draft, I believe, this pre-draft event where potential draftees
work out for teams. They meet with teams so that teams can get a sort of sense of the personality of players to figure out who they might want to draft in the NFL draft. And there's always been this idea that there's sort of these rough around the edges boys clubs where there's a lot of, I don't even know what to call it, but there's a lot of horsing around and also sort of non-decorous questions.
Boys will be boys kind of attitude.
Locker room talk, I think would literally be the best way to describe it. Darius Geis has now come out and said that during his meetings with teams, he was asked whether he likes men in, I guess, a completely unironic way, and whether his mother is a prostitute who sells herself. And he has come out and said that this took place, and of course the NFL is saying that's completely inappropriate, and we're going to be investigating it, and this is not something that should ever be going on. I found this very, very odd because it seems almost like, you know how sometimes you hear that in job interviews, interviewers will ask odd questions to sort of throw the person off or something like that. If that's the point of asking this question at an NFL combine, I don't know what you could possibly learn from it in terms of how the potential draftee would be on your team. Like, how would just asking a guy if he's gay tell you anything about sort of like what it would be like to have him on your team? I don't know.
Like, what's the reaction that you want to see?
Yeah, like what's a good reaction? Are they supposed to get
furious? Yeah. Are they supposed to be able to handle it?
That's a good question.
Cordially? I don't know.
What counts as the right reaction to being asked if you like men? And what would qualify as a bad reaction to do you like men? Or to asking someone if their mother is a prostitute, which seems sort of inappropriate as a question.
Yeah, that second one I don't understand at all.
Now, let me ask you this. When the NFL says that they were totally shocked and taken aback by this, and this violates the sort of guidelines that exist for interviewing potential players, and that they're going to investigate it, do you buy that the NFL really has no clue that this stuff goes on? Or do you think that they're just saying it in order to appear proper?
I'm sure they were opposed to it.
Yeah.
But they probably knew that these kind of questions were asked. Maybe not these specific ones.
Yeah.
And I think you have to be wary about it now, especially because there has been a gay player in the NFL, Michael Sam.
Yes.
And, you know, we're just in a different day and age. You can't be asking that kind of stuff.
I agree. I think that they know that this stuff's going on, and I think that they're just saying it for PR. And, oh, by the way, you just said weary. It's wary. I've been getting emails from people. It's W-A-R-Y because weary, W-E-A-R-Y, just means tired.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, well, wary would be cautious.
Yes,
which I think is what you meant there.
Have you still learned? Do you know the difference between further and farther yet? You still working on that one?
I have no idea. Let me see if I can. So, farther with an A would be more distant in a measurable way. So if something is 100 feet away versus 50 feet away, it's farther away. Whereas further would be more ideologically,
metaphorically. Yeah, you got it right.
I don't know that I use it right, though. Like, when I just instinctively say one or the other, I don't know that I use it correctly.
All right, well, I'll work on wary, and you'll work on further and farther.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll keep saying new on the basis of that cunning linguist correcting me. Yeah. All right, that's all I've got for today, really. We've got, but I do want to hear from people. 2 questions for the audience. Number 1, how are you feeling about the Critical Thinking miniseries? What's been released so far? If you've seen it, I hope you have. And number 2, how did you feel about the Trump-Russia long-form piece that was completed on the broadcast program today? Send me your thoughts.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.